In this very in-depth forecast, the Midwest is currently being monitored for severe weather as widespread scattered storms could harbor the potential of widespread massive hail larger than 2 inches, a couple of tornadoes, and widespread wind gusts upwards of 50 miles per hour. Everything you need to know on Project Gladiator. Hello everyone, welcome back to another Project Gladiator weather forecast. Today I'll be covering the weather for June 12th of 2024. Before I get into this forecast, I do want to say I'm sorry for taking so long to make another video since I went on vacation. I just wanted to have a little bit of time to myself as I've been doing this for a while, almost every day. Have been giving myself a little bit more time to myself, though. As you probably notice, I don't really have as much of a consistent schedule anymore, but I am trying to fix that. But I do like to have some more time to myself, so please forgive me if I do skip some dates here and there, but I will be making a forecast. I will be trying to get a forecast out each day of the summer because I do have more time, but recently I just wanted to have a little bit more time to myself, and I'm not gonna start off this week with anything big. I did skip a weekly overlook, so I am gonna give myself a little bit more time to get back into the swing of things. But what better way to start that off with starting another in-depth forecast, or doing another in-depth forecast that's not really going to be too heavy on me. So for today, we do have an enhanced risk for the Midwest, for northeastern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin there, with a slight risk that extends across the majority of Minnesota into portions of eastern South Dakota, northern Iowa, Wisconsin, and the upper peninsula of Michigan. Risks for today do include a 5% tornado risk for Minnesota and northern Wisconsin. You probably also noticed this 2% tornado risk for southern Florida there. We could see the potential for a couple tornadoes for the Midwest and the potential for an isolated tornado or two for Florida there. For our damaging wind gust risk, we do have a 30% for northern and eastern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin there, where we could see the potential of some widespread, not necessarily violent wind gusts, but definitely some widespread damaging wind gusts across this region. For our hail risk, we do have a 30% hail risk with the possibility of some significant hailstones indicated by that hash area, where we could see some hail greater than 2 inches in diameter across this region. So definitely some pretty significant hail is expected for today. And the wind gust risk in our damaging wind gust risk and our hail risk is going to be the primary risk with our storms, as well as don't forget that tornado risk. Definitely keep that tornado risk in mind regardless. But it does seem like the majority of the risk for this marginal risk for Florida is going to be that 2% tornado risk, as we don't really have all that much of a wind risk or a damaging hail risk for the marginal risk for southern Florida there. For tomorrow, we do have a pretty long slight risk that extends across southern Michigan, northern Indiana, Illinois, southern Iowa, northern Missouri, southeastern Nebraska, northeastern Kansas. Risks for tomorrow do include a 2% tornado risk, where we could see the potential for an isolated tornado or two, 15% damaging wind risk, where we could see the potential of some scattered damaging wind gusts, as well as a 15% hail risk, where we could see the potential of some scattered large hail that isn't necessarily going to be significant. For our day 3 outlook, we do have a double slight risk, one for the New England corridor extending from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, just the north of the New York City region, including the New York City region, Connecticut, northern Rhode Island, Massachusetts, and southern New Hampshire, as well as a slight risk for Nebraska, northern Kansas, and northeastern Colorado there. This does have a probabilistic 15%, where we aren't really looking for significant severe thunderstorms, but we could definitely see the potential for some scattered severe thunderstorms upcoming for those slight risk locations. For our day 4, day 8 outlook, we do have a day 6, 15% for Minnesota, the eastern South Dakota, and eastern North Dakota, where we could see the potential of some upcoming significant severe thunderstorms that we are definitely monitoring closely. So if you do live in the affected region, definitely make sure you are watching for any updates regarding June 17th to the 18th, as severe thunderstorms could definitely be significant for that region. Taking a look at our WPC outlooks and our risk for flash flooding, for today we do have a slight risk for southern Florida, where we could see the potential of some scattered flash flooding, as well as a slight risk for central into somewhat eastern Texas there, where we also could see the potential of some scattered flash flooding. For our risk for severe thunderstorms for today in the Midwest, we won't really see as much of a risk for flash flooding, but we could definitely see the potential potential of some isolated flash flooding. For tomorrow, we do have another slight risk for southern Florida there, where we could see the potential of some scattered flash flooding. We also have a marginal risk for Illinois, Indiana, southeastern Michigan, eastern Iowa, and northeastern Missouri there, where we could see the potential of some isolated flash flooding for tomorrow. For our day 3 outlook, we have another slight risk for southern Florida, where we could see the potential of some scattered flash flooding. With all that rainfall that's going to be building up across the next 3 days, we won't really see too much rainfall. We will definitely see quite a lot of rainfall for these regions, but we definitely won't see anything too significant in one day. But after the next 3 days of extremely heavy rainfall and the potential of some scattered flash flooding, that will all build up and could potentially be quite dangerous for some of the areas in southern Florida there, where you are subject to some flash flooding. If you do live in the affected region, definitely make sure you are watching out for any risks of flash flooding, especially if you know you live in a area that is prone to flash flooding. This does include Miami, Fort Lauderdale, southern Florida, the Everglades region, parts of the Keys, as well as Tampa Bay, and to the south of Tampa Bay and Fort Myers. Definitely make sure you're watching out for the risk for flash flooding if you do live in that affected region, as heavy rainfall over the next 3 days could definitely be quite dangerous. We also have a slight risk for day 3 outlook for the New England corridor for Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, where we could see the potential of some isolated flash flooding. We also have a marginal risk for the central plains into portions of the high plains for southeastern South Dakota, Nebraska, western Iowa, western Kansas, eastern Colorado, and northeastern New Mexico, where we could see the potential of some isolated flash flooding. Taking a look at our weather model, starting off with our 500 millibars in our upper air pattern, as well as our surface observations and how that's going to affect our risk for severe thunderstorms. Starting off with our upper air pattern, we are expected to see a pretty powerful jet that is going to advect across the northern half of the United States here. We do have a little bit of a ridge in the southeast here that is kind of preventing that much activity from the southern half of the region, but we do have this pretty powerful jet that is advecting into the northern half of the United States, and that is going to be supportive of our risk for severe thunderstorms for today, as that will support quite a lot of lift. We are expected to see just the nose of that that jet there with some pretty decent flow in agreement with the rest of our models. That's going to reach upwards of 50 to potentially 55 miles per hour across this region, maybe even approaching 60 knots in some regions. Knots, not miles per hour. We are expected to see this jet increase over the next couple of hours, upwards of 70 to 80 miles per hour, knots across this region. However, that will be after our primary risk for severe thunderstorms, so that shouldn't really affect it too much, but we will definitely have some pretty decent flow across this region when our storms are ongoing, and that will definitely support quite a lot of shear, as in support our risk for hail as well. As far as our surface observation goes, we do have a little bit of a surface low that is across North Dakota there into southern Canada, and we do have a cold front that is draped across the central plains that is slowly pushing into the region, and that will trigger our severe thunderstorms by the time that moves into the region. We do have a little bit of a warm front that is kind of stalled into a stationary front across northern North Dakota and northern Minnesota. We could see the potential of additional storms that may fire along that warm front that will really pose that much of a hazard to regions such as North Dakota, northern Minnesota there, and potentially southern Canada, but we shouldn't really see too much activity along that warm front, but it's definitely something to watch out for. The primary risk will definitely be along that cold front. Taking a look at our low-level jet and how that's going to affect our risk for tornadoes across the Midwest there, we are expected to see a decently strong low-level jet that is going to move into the region, and you can definitely see how its direction of the wind definitely varies from our 500 millibars, where at 850 millibars we see some decently strong winds out of the southeast here, comparative to those at 500 millibars that are kind of out of the west and even out of the northwest, kind of kind of pushing to the southeast. You definitely see that difference in the winds with height, and that will definitely support some curved photographs in the risk for tornadoes across this region with quite a lot of directional shear. We shouldn't really see too much of a strong low-level jet. Our low-level jet is definitely going to be much more modest, as it does look like the majority of our flow is expected to stay below 40 knots in some regions, but it will likely range anywhere from 30 knots to 37 knots across this region, potentially even higher. It may get up to 40 knots, but it is definitely going to be a little bit more modest, but will definitely support some pretty decent directional shear across this region, and definitely going to be supportive of a risk for tornadoes across this region. Taking a look at our 200 millibars in our far upper air pattern and how that's going to affect our risk for severe thunderstorms overall with our defluence, as well as our risk for hail with our speed shear. Just on the nodes of that jet that we are expected to see, we are expected to see some pretty strong flow that is going to back this region and feed into this region with 200 millibar flow that is expected to get upwards of 80 to 90 knots across this region. That will definitely support quite a lot of shear backing our cold front in our storms that are going to form along that cold front ahead of our cold front. Because we are on the majority of the nose of this jet, we don't really see too much flow ahead of our cold front, with much weaker 200 millibar flow anywhere from 50 knots to 70 knots across this region. Definitely going to see some weaker flow ahead of our storms. However, backing our cold front, we will definitely see some pretty decent speed shear that will definitely be supportive of a significant hail risk across this region. As far as our defluence goes, we don't really see too much spreading of our wind vectors. We definitely have some very subtle but somewhat noticeable defluence. It is mainly further down to the south into southern Minnesota and northern Iowa, where we see the majority of our spreading of our wind vectors. However, it does look like it's just the majority of the winds that are turning down to the south and kind of spreading out. We don't really see a whole lot of defluence in a very compact area. It kind of just spreads out across a very large area. I don't really know how to describe it, but it doesn't really look like much to me. There may be a little bit of defluence that I'm missing across this region, especially in southern Minnesota and northern Iowa, that may aid in our overall risk for severe thunderstorms, but I just don't really see defluence playing too much of a role in our risk for severe thunderstorms for today. Taking a look at our storm relative velocity and how that's going to affect our risk for tornadoes across this region, we are going to have to focus very heavily on our overlap of our directional shear and the overlap of our instability, because our instability is expected to be strongest way before we see our strongest directional shear. That could definitely lead to more modest directional shear across this region, more modest directional shear for our storms to work with, and could definitely lead to overall more of a limited risk for tornadoes. Where our low-level jet is going to be a little bit weaker with our greatest instability, or even by the time our instability is weakening by this point, we could see storm relative velocity values that may range anywhere from 100 meters squared second squared, maybe 200 meters squared a second squared across this region. Is definitely going to be a little bit more on the modest end. However, when that low-level jet increases as storms move into southern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin, we will see that low-level jet increase with storm relative velocity values increasing with it, with storm relative velocity values that are expected to reach anywhere from 200 meters squared to potentially 250 meters squared second squared across this region. So overall, definitely some pretty modest storm relative velocity values, and by the time our low-level jet increases to its full potential across this region, again, we will definitely see weaker storm relative velocity values. So there may be a very short time frame where we will see the best overlap between our instability and our directional shear. That will probably be around the evening hours, around the golden hour, when we see a little bit more of a temperature gradient, and that low-level jet begins to strengthen as a result of that greater temperature gradient with the sun setting. And some decently strong instability as the sun begins to set. We still have that surface heating, but we just don't have as much anymore because the sun is beginning to set right around the sunset hours. That will probably be our prime time for tornado genesis across this region. However, I definitely do think that we may have some problems with our risk for tornadoes, especially with the fact that we may not really see as much overlap between our strong instability and our strong directional shear, but we will definitely see a small sliver of time where we could definitely see the potential for a couple tornadoes across this region. Taking a look at our bulk shear, this is definitely something that I actually didn't really take into account before looking at this, but we are expected to see some pretty decently strong shear, not necessarily backing our storms. We are expected to see a little bit weaker not storm relative velocity, but bulk shear values. This is speed shear that we're looking at for our hail risk. We are expected to see weaker bulk shear values backing our storms than ahead of our storms. Bulk shear values ahead of our storms getting upwards of 50 to 40 knots across this region, even upwards of 55 knots in some areas, potentially even greater. That will definitely be very supportive of our risk for hail and even the potential for some significant hail greater than 2 inches across this region. But one thing that I didn't really take into account was a low-level jet for our speed shear. I do know that our low-level jet is going to enhance shear and our speed shear locally. Not only will it enhance speed shear, but it does enhance our storm relative velocity and directional shear, as that's usually what we focus on when we look at our low-level jet. So I didn't really take into account for our bulk shear. However, if we pull up a sounding here that is backing our storms, you'll see that we do have an elongated hodograph. Not as much flow in the mid levels there, but we definitely do have a pretty elongated hodograph that is fairly indicative of the potential for some significant hail. However, when we get a sounding from ahead of our storms, we still see that elongated hodograph, but we have that hump in the low levels of our hodograph, indicating the potential for tornadoes with our directional shear. But that also elongates our hodograph and allows for more speed shear and aids in that hail risk overall. I'll definitely try and take this into account in future videos. I actually didn't really focus on that beforehand, but that is definitely a good tidbit to look at, as it could definitely wildly make a difference in our speed shear across this region. So with that, we will definitely see quite a lot of bulk shear across this region, quite a lot of speed shear. That will definitely be very supportive of the potential for some significant hail greater than 2 inches with some of these storms. Taking a look at our composite reflectivity, we won't necessarily go over our timing. I definitely would suggest checking with your weather provider for the timing if you do live in these affected regions, because I've already proven myself time and time again that I absolutely suck at the timing for these storms and getting the timing right, especially with different time zones. So I'm just going to go over some general radar analysis, because our composite reflectivity can provide quite a lot of insight into our risk for severe thunderstorms and how that might influence our various risks. So with our various model members here, we're going to start with our HRRR. Something I do want to note is that we are expected to see quite a lot of scattered rainfall and even some heavier rainfall in some regions, and some light severe thunderstorms that did occur across Minnesota, and I think still are occurring in some portions of southern Minnesota. This has led to a little bit of a cold pool across this region, which we will look at our temperatures for that. However, that cold pool could definitely be a significantly limiting factor with our overall risk for severe thunderstorms, and definitely provides quite a lot of uncertainty, especially with how our instability is going to recover after our rain showers. That again definitely provides quite a lot of uncertainty, because if our instability can't recover quick enough, we could definitely see a overall lower risk for severe thunderstorms than what is currently being indicated. But if it does recover quite quickly, then we could definitely see an up to par risk for severe thunderstorms for this enhanced risk region, but it could also definitely lead to some overall lower risks in some areas. So our residual outflow boundary will definitely need to be something that we will watch. Definitely going to be pretty limiting factor and provide quite a lot of uncertainty. However, we are expected to see our storms that are going to fire according to our HRRR, with a couple more dominant storms in some regions, mainly across northern Minnesota into Canada there, with some scattered severe thunderstorms that are going to be around it. When these storms are definitely going to be a little bit more isolated, they will have the best chance of producing a tornado. However, our HRRR does indicate that they may become quite messy and even potentially even linear in some areas. And when that does happen, we could still see the potential for tornadoes, but it will definitely transition into potentially more of a hail risk and more of a damaging wind risk. But again, that tornado risk will definitely still be possible with those storms when they do become more linear and more messy. But it is definitely something to watch for, because our storm mode on top of our residual outflow boundary, both of those could be some pretty limiting factors. For our HRW NSSL, it overall indicates more of a linear system across this region, with storms starting off as more of an isolated system, more scattered isolated storms into northern Minnesota, but further northeast or northwest comparative to what the ARRR is saying. So definitely some disagreements there, especially with our storm mode. HRW ARW is on line with our HRW NSSL with more of that linear mode. Our HRW FV3 is online with that more linear mode. NAM Nest is also online with that more linear mode, but is kind of more in line with our ARRR, as it does start off as more of an isolated to semi-discrete mode, and you could definitely see those pretty discrete storms. It's not really semi-discrete, it is discrete, but it does become linear quite quickly. ARRR isn't included, or no, ARRR is just too far ahead on our timeline. Our ARRR 6 hour is pretty in line with our regular ARRR. It does become more linear into northern Wisconsin there. HRW NSSL 12 hour starts off as scattered and becomes a little bit more messy, but it is mainly remaining isolated to scattered for the majority of our risk. HRW ARW a 12 hour is definitely a little bit more of a discrete mode there, and it doesn't really turn into more of a linear system. It does become quite messy, but it does kind of die off before coming a linear system. HRW FV3 12 hour, some discrete storms, but it is definitely a little bit more linear. And then finally NAM Nest 12 hour. Sorry that this segment's taking so long. This one's a weird one. I don't know what's really going on here. I think there may be too much of a cold pull on our NAM Nest 12 hour for that many storms to really fire on this model. However, it does begin as a sort of a discrete mode, and it does become messy quite fast. We do have a pretty decent isolated storm that does develop across central Minnesota. However, it does remain quite messy to semi-discrete and discrete in some areas. So I definitely think that this will probably start off as a little bit more of a semi-discrete mode and potentially even more messy. That's when our greatest tornado risk will be, and then it will quickly organize into potentially a little bit more of a messy to linear system, indicated by the majority of our models as it moves into northern Wisconsin and eastern portions of Minnesota. Taking a look at our temperature models and how that's going to indicate our instability, you can see our cold front pretty well here on our high resolution ensemble forecast, indicated by that temperature tongue here, or that pressure tongue there, where our cold front would be. And you can also see that shift in the winds there where our cold front would be. But you can also see that cold pull really, really well there on our temperature models here. Pretty large cold pull. And if this is even just a little bit too far to the west, which it could very well be, however, our high resolution ensemble forecast definitely indicates it being further off to the east. It is agreeing with our ARRR in various models pretty well. If that cold pull is a little bit too far to the west, it may limit our risk for severe thunderstorms just a little bit too much and make them significantly worse than what they are forecasted. Worse as in more messy and not really too severe. But that cold pull could definitely have some significant limiting factors. However, our high resolution ensemble forecast is indicating temperatures getting upwards of 80 to potentially 85 across this region. Definitely going to be getting pretty warm, possibly, depending on where that cold pool is. That will definitely support quite a lot of instability as our storms begin to fire. However, that will drop pretty quickly down to the 60s and into the 65s, the mid 60s, by the time the sun does set. So By the time the sun does set, we will definitely see significantly worse instability that will definitely be much more on the weaker side and support overall more of a damaging wind risk and more of a hail risk, as we won't really see much of a tornado risk with some weaker instability values. In fact, our storms should be dying off as we move into Wisconsin due to the lack of surface instability with our sun setting. Taking a look at our dew points and how that's going to affect our instability on top of our temperatures, we are expected to see some pretty decent dew point values across this region, with dew points that are expected to get upwards of at least the 60s and potentially even the mid and getting close to the upper 60s across this region. On top of our pretty warm temperatures, we will definitely see quite a lot of decent instability across this region, and it could also be quite strong, especially with it being the middle of June and it being midsummer. So with these pretty nice dew point values, that are probably a little bit more conservative in reality, because this is the high resolution ensemble forecast, we will definitely see some pretty decent instability across this region that will definitely be ample enough to fuel our risk for severe thunderstorms across this region. However, those dew point values are expected to decrease as the sun sets and we lose a little bit more of our heat, and that does lead to lower dew point values, but we will definitely see quite a lot of moisture still. But as the sun does set again, that will definitely lead to weaker surface instability, so we will have to wait around our golden hour for that best tornado risk to materialize. Taking a look at our lapse rates and how that's going to affect our instability, we are expected to see some pretty decent lapse rates across this region, with lapse rates that are expected to get upwards of the mid and upper sevens across this region, on top of our pretty warm temperatures before our storms begin to fire, and when the sun does begin to set, we will see some pretty decent instability as a result of our decent moisture and some pretty warm temperatures. However, those lapse rates will continue. They will weaken definitely substantially as storms move into the overnight hours, and we will see weaker instability as a result, but we will definitely see some pretty decent dew point values that will linger, but some lower temperature values again will definitely lead to quite a lot of lower end instability. And with the influence of our cold pool that may remain across this region, that also again provides much more uncertainty regarding our instability. However, if we didn't really have that much influence from our cold pool, if we don't really see that much influence from our residual cold pool, we could definitely see quite a lot of instability across this region. Definitely think upwards of 2,000, maybe even 3,000 may be possible, but will definitely be at least ample enough to fuel our severe thunderstorms across this region. Taking a look at our convective inhibition, how that's going to affect our overall risk for severe thunderstorms and our pattern for our severe thunderstorms into the afternoon hours, we do have a pretty thick cap across this region, especially as a result of that cold pool, where that cold pool is expected to remain capped and may lead to some more widespread convective inhibition across this region, potentially limiting our severe thunderstorms a little bit more. Our cap is expected to fully erode, allowing for storm development. However, just a couple miles to the east, actually more than a couple miles, in pretty close proximity though, we will definitely see some pretty strong convective inhibition across this region. And any storms that fires a little bit too far to the east may be subject to that convective inhibition, may not even fire at all. So that convective inhibition, due to that residual cold pool and our residual outflow boundary from our morning time storms, will definitely be a pretty limiting factor to our storms across this region, as it will lead to some residual convective inhibition across this region. However, our cap will definitely fully erode where our storms will begin, but we will definitely have to watch to see how our convective inhibition will affect our storms. Because if our convective inhibition is too strong, if our storms fire off a little bit too far to the east and are more subject to that stronger convective inhibition and our weaker temperatures and our lower temperatures from that residual cold pool, we could definitely see a significantly lower risk for severe thunderstorms across this region than what is actually forecasted. So definitely some pretty big uncertainty across this region regarding that cold pool and our morning time storms, as well as our timing of our storms and how our instability is going to line up with our directional shear. Definitely have a couple problems with this forecast. But regardless, again, our various risks do stand if everything does come together. Taking a look at our most unstable cape and how that's going to fuel our overall risk for severe thunderstorms. Before our storms are expected to fire, we are expected to see quite a lot of instability across this region, with most unstable cape values that are expected to get upwards of the mid and upper 2000s and even upwards of the low 3000s in some regions of Minnesota there. And when our storms do fire, they will be able to use up that pretty strong instability. However, as the sun does begin to set, as storms move into more eastern Minnesota along the border of Wisconsin and Minnesota there, we will see significantly weaker most unstable cape values, with cape values that are expected to drop down to the low 1000s and the upper triple digits. Could definitely fuel a very low end risk for tornadoes, especially with that enhanced low level jet by the time the sun does set, and our risk for our hail and our risk for our damaging wind gusts across this region, which will definitely be overall more favorable if this does turn into more of a linear system as our storms move into Wisconsin. Overall, definitely going to see that you can definitely see that very short window, that pretty short window for our risk for tornadoes and our overall risk for our strongest severe thunderstorms. If I had to outline an area for our strongest severe thunderstorms, I would definitely have them around here when the sun is still at least somewhat high in the atmosphere, and we do have a little bit more stronger instability and definitely a weaker low level jet, but it is definitely beginning to increase as the sun does begin to set. This area will likely see our best risk for severe thunderstorms and the best overlap between our instability and our shear. Taking a look at our surface-based cape and how that's going to fuel our risk for surface-based storms and our potential for tornadoes, it does look like the majority of our most unstable cape is expected to translate down to our surface, meaning that storms are expected to be surface-based and support the potential for tornadoes. However, as the sun does set, we are expected to see a really rapid drop in our surface-based cape, and that's when our most unstable cape will definitely take hold, and we will see weaker surface-based cape compared to our most unstable cape. We could definitely see a couple surface-based storms across this region. However, some storms will likely begin becoming elevated across this region, favoring more of a risk for large hail and the potential for damaging wind gusts. And that's again why I say that this region is probably going to see our best overlap with our directional shear and our surface-based cape for the potential for tornadoes across this region. But again, this entire area will still see the potential for at least a couple of tornadoes and the potential for an isolated tornado or two, the potential for some large hail that could be greater than 2 inches in diameter, as well as some widespread damaging wind gusts across this region. Taking a look at our 0 to 3 kilometer instability and how that's going to aid in fueling our severe thunderstorms overall, we may see a small pool of some weak 0 to 3 kilometer instability. However, we won't really see too much as far as 0 to 3 kilometer instability. The majority of our work will be done by our surface-based cape and our most unstable cape, with it leaning on our most unstable cape later on in the afternoon into the overnight hours. Won't really see too much 0 to 3 kilometer instability, but that very weak pool of some 0 to 3 kilometer instability may be a very small aid in fueling our severe thunderstorms, but definitely not really too much. Taking a look at our energy helicity index values and how that's going to indicate our risk for tornadoes across this region, we are using the HRRR, which is a member of the High Resolution Ensemble Forecast. Before we do look at this, I do want to note that the High Resolution Ensemble Forecast, although it is a really handy tool in forecasting, it is significantly more conservative compared to what its various model members is outputting. The HRRR definitely has somewhat of a scary look to it, actually, with some really high energy helicity index values that are very indicative of a risk for tornadoes, even significant tornadoes, with definitely a little bit of convective inhibition there to be noted, but we also have some pretty strong instability there that isn't really too much out of line with our high resolution ensemble forecast and our window for best risk for tornadoes. But we definitely do have some noticeably higher storm relative velocity values and a pretty decently curved photograph there, definitely very indicative of the potential for tornadoes across this region. And based off of this, I would definitely think that a conditional significant tornado would be possible. Again, definitely heavily conditional, especially with that residual outflow boundary and our convective inhibition, as you can see here. But our A-R is definitely indicating overall more of a ballistic output comparative to our high resolution ensemble forecast, which is honestly to be expected with our high resolution ensemble forecast system being more conservative. Even though it takes into account our various models in every single one of them. This is definitely something to keep in note. I definitely think that this could potentially be more of the worst case scenario, where we definitely could see a much stronger low level jet that isn't as conservative compared to our high resolution ensemble forecast. Some pretty decently strong instability and some noticeably higher storm velocity values. I definitely think that based off of this, a conditional significant tornado is possible. But with the conditionality of it, we won't see any higher probabilities for tornadoes indicated by the SPC. But this is definitely something to take into account, especially with our really strong instability. Taking a look at our wind gust models and how that's going to indicate the potential for damaging wind gusts across this region. For our 30%, it is definitely a little bit more of a smaller area, but this is definitely where storms could potentially be a little bit more linear to messy, which will definitely be overall more favorable for the potential of damaging wind gusts across this region. Models are indicating the potential of wind gusts that could potentially be significant, upwards of 60, potentially even approaching 70 miles per hour in some regions. Definitely think that overall wind gusts should probably be around 50 to 60 miles per hour across this region, potentially reaching 70 miles per hour in some regions. That will likely be mostly possible in the 30% risk for damaging wind gusts, where storms could definitely be a little bit more linear. But you could definitely see where we do have those widespread damaging wind gusts, and they could definitely be pretty strong, upwards of 50 to 60 miles per hour, and potentially even greater across this region. Taking a look at our hail parameters and how that's going to indicate the potential for large hail. We are hours out from our storms actually firing, so our hail parameters are definitely going to be a little bit behind, but already they are indicating the overlap between our ingredients for hail and the potential for some large hail already materializing across the central plains. Again, this will move eastward. With our instability, that's going to move eastward along our cold front. And again, that is already indicating our overlap of our parameters for our hail and our different ingredients. For our significant hail, we do have a couple twos here. That is definitely indicating the potential for significant hail, and will likely increase as our storms move into this region, and we see overall more overlap with our different hail ingredients. For our SARS hail size, it is indicating upwards of 2 to potentially even 3 inches of hail across this region. Not inches of hail as in accumulation, but in diameter, how large our hail could be. And that will move eastward as well. I definitely don't think 4 inches is possible. It will probably be anywhere from 2 inches, 2.5 inches, maybe 3 inches. But again, significant hail is definitely possible across this region, as already being indicated by our SARS hail size. For our SARS hail significant percentage, the percentage for significant hail, we do have upwards of 80% and 70% across this region that will likely move eastward as our storms do develop and our cold front moves eastward. These models are already indicating that we do have a pretty big overlap for our various hail ingredients across this region and the potential for significant hail upcoming. Now that I've told you the weather, please go down to the description and check out the socials for Project Gladiator and join the Discord for any updates on Project Gladiator. If you live in any of the areas I covered for today, please stay weather alert for the time being. If you notice anything might have been wrong in this forecast or like to make a suggestion or ask a question, please leave a comment. 3 other channels I highly suggest you check out are One Nation Weather, Weather Watcher, and JaxonWX, and hopefully I'll be able to see you guys tomorrow in another forecast.